Today we're going to be discussing, just in general, because this is a really complicated cat, man. We're going to be discussing the one and only Mr. Wynton Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis. Born October 18th, 1961, in a suburb of New Orleans known as Kenner. His parents are Ellis Marsalis Jr. and Dolores Ferdinand Marsalis. He was one of several sons, children. They were prolific, the Marsalises, and several musicians came out of that family as well, including Delphio, great trombone player, Branford, the trombonist, obviously Wynton, the trumpet player, and Jason, the compositional and percussion genius of the family. Wynton's life started like everybody's life. He liked to do stuff everybody else does. He liked to play basketball, liked to do jokes, liked to go outside and play and, do all the stuff young guys like to do. Didn't have a serious interest in music at all. His father was a piano player, jazz piano player, who started life as a saxophone player. But once he got into his later years as a music major, he switched to classical piano. And that became his instrument of choice going forward. At any rate, one day he is sitting with three trumpet players at a table. He was at that time playing with Al Hurt, so Al Hurt was sitting there, and Miles Davis was sitting there, and Clark Terry was sitting there. And Ellis just jokingly said, I think I'm going to have to get my son Wynton a trumpet. And they all laughed because they knew that Ellis was a pianist, and they knew that Wynton had been named for the great Wynton Kelly, who is a great pianist, and all of a sudden he wants this kid to have a trumpet. And so the guys just kind of look at him, but Al Hurt went, I've got several trumpets, I'll give you one. So at 6 years of age, young Wynton got a trumpet. And it just kind of sat there for another 6 years. He didn't practice, he didn't do anything. He just kind of looked at it and played with it and put it back in the case and went outside and played ball and looked at the girls and do all the things that young guys do. Somewhere around 12, he started practicing and got pretty serious about it. He was going to Ben Franklin High School in New Orleans, and pretty soon entered the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts. And his major was classical music. You heard it, classical music. That was what he was doing, and that's what he did for a long time, including playing in orchestras in New Orleans area, being one of the youngest players ever in the Civic Orchestra there, and winning contests playing classical literature on the trumpet, including the Haydn Concerto and Bach's Brandenburg at a very young age, and this is all before the age of 17. So when he made that transition from I'm just going to be a kid to, you know what, I think I'm going to take this trumpet serious, he went full blast, man. So now he is so good that he is blowing all the pros away, and he's starting to look around at his culture there, because although he's studying classical music, you hear New Orleans, baby. So he starts playing in a funk band as well, because you got to get the shaking going on, and playing in the funk bands, you get to watch all the pretty girls dance. He liked that. And then he played in those famous New Orleans street bands as well. And so he liked all that attention too. So he had two sides to him now. He had that classical side, but he had that funky New Orleans side going as well. He ended up leaving New Orleans and going to New York to study at Juilliard. And just like Miles Davis, he did study there, but not for long. About a year, I think he went there in '81. And by '82, Bohanna, Art Blakey, had drafted him for a big band he had, and then later added him to the Messengers, and soon after, Wynton became the music director for the Messengers and did his first recordings with Art Blakey. And Wynton says it was this relationship with Art Blakey that caused him to decide not to return to Juilliard and not to return to classical music, but to pursue jazz, although he obviously kept going with the classical music as well. Most people know that Wynton is still the only musician in history to win a Grammy in classical music and jazz in the same year. The only musician in history. And his chief influences are everybody from Maurice Andre, classical trumpet, to Dizzy Gillespie. So we had a variety of influences on both sides of the horn, as we like to say, both the classical and the jazz. But soon after playing with Bohemian's band, he went on tour with Herbie Hancock. So, I mean, he's at the top of the game now. You go from the Messengers to Herbie, you're playing with the bad cats of all the bad cats of all the bad cats. And that's working for him. His first recordings, I think, around the same time, 82, he had a contract with Columbia. I remember discovering him about this time because I had been to New Orleans in 82 and saw his father, Ellis, teaching at the New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts, and I had never heard of Wynton. During that summer, when I was on tour with my dear Suncoast Sound, I met a good friend of mine, Frank Doherty, who said he participated in a recording session with a young trumpet player who he said was going to turn the world on its ear. And that person was Wynton Marsalis. I remember the conversation. And about a year later, when this album started just bouncing all over the world and people was like, Wynton, 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 I went, Frank must have known what he was talking about. Not this Frank, but Frank Doherty. Soon after that first album, many other albums came about. He started a group with his brother, Kenny Watts, with Kenny, Johnny Moffitt on the bass, did 1 or 2 albums, did some tours. Branford and Kenny Kirkland left to play with Sting, and that kind of ended that particular band. Shorty Moffitt went on to a solo career, and Wynton recast his band with a total new set of musicians that included Wycliffe Gordon and eventually Marcus Roberts, you know, all with a Florida connection there, Florida A&M for Wycliffe, Todd Williams, Warm Daddy, Russell Anderson, expanded group, and that continued. The sextet was just awesome, but the music went from the front edge, hard bop he had been doing with Branford, to a more reflective revisiting of New York traditions, or New Orleans traditions, New Orleans traditions. A big part of his heart, as was Duke Ellington, which is going to come up later, as he helped direct a summer music series for Lincoln Center called Classical Jazz Series for the summer. And it was so successful that they offered him a job, and pretty soon he had his own little department. And pretty soon he had his own entity, Jazz, at Lincoln Center. And pretty soon it was a separate independent entity that worked under the Lincoln Center umbrella and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. He is director of that, director of the center, many education programs, but then most certainly preserving the music and bringing a whole lot of people to the front as only Wynton can do. There are some people who say he is too restrictive. When Miles Davis first met him later, as Wynton has some stature, and Miles is playing his fusion funk kind of thing, and Wynton walks up, Miles goes, "Oh, here come the police," because Wynton had this very strict, and some people say narrow view of what jazz is. I'm not so sure. Jazz is jazz. Fusion is fusion. That's jazz and something else, not just jazz. But anyway, that's another story for another day. At any rate, Wynton reciprocated as he referred to Miles as a great general who gone on to fight for another country. He abandoned jazz for rock and roll. Poof! So that was the relationship that Miles and Wynton had, but that was in Wynton's youth. Some of the beautiful things he did was the story of Jesse and Leona, which is embedded in Blood on the Fields, a jazz oratorio about two slaves fighting for their lives and fighting for freedom. Several movements. The first piece ever to win a Pulitzer Prize for music. I think that's somewhere around 1997. He's done all sorts of extraordinary works, which I really don't have time to get into now. This is such a complicated figure, and he is so hyper-productive in his playing, in his composing, in his advocacy for this music and musicians and for the culture and for so many other things that we're gonna have to come back to Wynton and deal with some of the works that he is doing outside of jazz at Lincoln Center, because there are lots of things and recordings and lectures and educational programs, and you name it, Wynton is doing it. So let me say this. This is a guy that did not at first embrace music as his path, but look at where he wound up. Once he got started, you couldn't stop him. The first and only Pulitzer for music, Blood on the Fields. That's him. Creating this whole thing we call jazz at Lincoln Center. Dizzy's Coca-Cola and all of that is part of his vision. Essentially Ellington, which we will talk about in an upcoming lecture. And the fact that he is at 22 years of age, he won Grammys in classical and jazz. And to this moment, no one has ever done that. And you know what? There probably never will be no one who does. Wynton is a singular genius of our time. Thank you so very much. We'll get back to Wynton in an upcoming series. Thank you.